Welcome to the Dread Journal. I am Ulrich Mossberg, and I shall be your guide through some of the most horrifying true stories sent to us. These stories are not urban legends, myths, or tall tales. They are true testimonials sent to us by those who have worked on oil rigs. These are tales sent by those who feel they must hide their identities, either due to the question of their sanities or hiding from corporate authorities, but still want to be heard. Oil rigs are some of the most desolate places on our planet. They are surrounded by deep, dark waters, and the terrors they hide are reflected in these stories. Now, let us look into some of these tales and see what will forever be added into the Dread Journal. I'm sending you this story with the names changed due to privacy concerns, both yours and mine. When I tried telling other people about this story, they either thought I was crazy or had had a few too many drinks. I also know that the information I'm about to share is going to change the way you look at the world, so do with it what you will, but I'm trusting that someone will finally believe it. My name is Frank, and I was an electrician on a spar oil platform in the Gulf of Mexico. When I first started working there, I had to get used to the 12-hour shifts, but it wasn't too bad, considering I had a 2-week vacation every month. At the time, I had no kids or wife. I had an apartment near New Orleans, and the job paid well, so I spent my free time eating good food and drinking on Bourbon Street. My coworkers were all hard-hat blue-collar workers, save for the rig managers, geologists, and engineers with whom I also worked. There was one guy I worked with called Sam. Sam was a joker, and he was always one of the people who livened up the place. His go-to humor was perverted in nature, but in a work environment without women, he was able to get away with it. Sam was originally from Florida and had always spent his time around the ocean. He was a floorman and was able to get this job after he had to drop out of college. Although some of the older guys saw him as annoying at first, his humor and warm, supportive personality gave life to the often boring work environment. Sam was in school to study meteorology, but he had to drop out for financial reasons. He had to take out loans just to attend, and there was no financial aid available to him. Even so, Sam knew that he wanted to go back and finish his degree. Eventually, almost all of the other guys and I saw him as our nephew, and despite his humor, he was a hard worker. I even remember having gumbo and drinks with him whenever we visited New Orleans. The other guy I'll mention is John, a rig manager. Despite his position, he just wanted us to call him John because he found formalities annoying. John was the opposite of Sam in almost every respect. John was serious, strict, and punctual with everything he did. Unless it was work-related and urgent, he was the kind of guy you wouldn't want to talk to. John was there to work. He was the only guy who didn't take to Sam. While he wasn't pleasant, he was efficient, and in all of my years of working on oil rigs as an electrician, I had never seen anyone as dedicated as him. No one really knew why he was so obsessed with the job, but we didn't question it because he was fair to everyone, and he would often give brief praise to someone who had fixed an issue, saying things like good work or well done before leaving it at that. Sam did try to get him to open up a few times, but after a few botched interactions, John just started ignoring Sam unless it was urgent. Eventually, the two gave each other space, and work continued like that for a while, with John only talking to Sam when it was necessary, and Sam knowing to save his humor for the other guys. At least, that's how it was supposed to be. One day in July, Sam went back to the rig as usual before me. I would spend another 3 days by myself after I saw him off at his Uber back home. The next day, I overdid it in one of the bars, and spent that night trying to sleep off the booze I had drunk earlier. At around 3 a.m., I got a phone call from my supervisor on the rig. He told me that there had been an electrical fire. While the rig was fine and we were able to keep it under wraps from the media, Sam had died in the fire. His body suffered multiple grievous burn wounds, and he ended up passing away before the paramedics could make it to the rig. I was shocked to hear this, and all I could do was try my best to try and stay calm, as my supervisor explained that his family was already notified and that the rig was still safe to work on. But I could feel my tears trickling down my face as I heard that. His funeral was a few weeks later. It was a closed casket due to the burn wounds, and he was buried in Florida. None of us could attend because of our work, so we just raised a toast to him during one of our lunch breaks and promised to keep working as best as we could in his memory. Even John, who was in the lunchroom with us, raised his cup and said, "To Sam." A year later, I was still working on the oil rig after a raise and a renewed contract came my way. By then, most of the guys who worked with Sam went on to other careers. The only one whom I still recognized was John, and while I didn't like interacting with him on most days, it was good to know that there was someone besides me who remembered Sam. One night, I was checking the equipment in the communications booth, ensuring that everything was working properly, and replacing some of the older components during the usual monthly inspection. John's office was next door, and while it was a bit later at night, he was still on his computer, looking over some documents that I couldn't see. I was near one of the desks of the communications workers who was on lunch break, and I heard a voice come out of his headphones. The other guy was looking over records of communications on his desk, and I went over to him after I closed the circuit panel. "Hey, I'm hearing a voice coming out of the headphones," I said, and he turned to look at me with a raised eyebrow. "That's impossible. It's 10 p.m. and the sonars haven't picked up anything," he responded, and I pointed to the headphones that had the voice coming from it. "Okay, then how do you explain that?" I asked, and when he turned to look at it, he heard the noise too and seemed annoyed. It must be one of the radios again. We've had issues with those interfering with our communications," he responded before getting up. "I'll see who it is this time," he said, almost sounding defeated. Once he put on the headphones, he spoke into the microphone. "This is Oil Rig 237 hailing from the communications room. Please identify yourself," he said. And within seconds, he turned to me. "Hey, you're Frank, right?" he asked, and I nodded. "Yeah, that's me," I said plainly, and he took off the headphones. "Apparently, whoever it is wants to speak to you," he said, and I seemed confused as I walked over to put on the headphones. "Frank speaking," I said, expecting to hear someone asking me how to fix their walkie or solve whatever issue was causing it on their floor. And after a few seconds, I heard a voice. "Deck 3, 4 o'clock a.m., the voice said, and I froze on the spot. "Sam!" I shouted out, loud enough for even John to hear, and the voice spoke again. "Deck 3, 4 a.m., it said, and I threw the headphones off while breathing heavily. My heart pounded as the communications worker looked up at me, then picked up the headphones from the floor. "What's the matter with you?" he asked, looking confused, and I couldn't begin to put my thoughts together until I came to a conclusion that made me angry. This had to be a prank. Someone who knew Sam was on this rig besides me and was somehow able to get his voice. I grabbed the headphones again in a rage, and I nearly screamed into them. "Listen, you piece of garbage. If you're gonna prank me, then prank me, but don't use Sam's voice again!" I shouted, and before I could hear anything else, John's door opened and he came up to me and took the headphones off me, glaring at me like I had done something awful. "My office, now," he said, and I walked into his office, leaving the communications worker confused, but he put the headphones back on before John closed the door, and we both sat down. John was across from me at his desk, and I was now less worried about hearing Sam's voice than I was about having John be angry with me. John just looked at me with his piercing gaze and put his hands together, interlocking his fingers as they covered his mouth and nose. "Explain yourself," he said, and I took a deep breath. "Look, I'm sorry for the outburst. It's just that I heard Sam's voice over the communications," I explained, and John didn't so much as blink. "Sam? You mean the one that died here last year?" he asked, not changing his intonation. All I could do was nod. Frank, John began. I know what happened was upsetting, but that was last year. Put it behind you, he said, not even acknowledging what I said. I looked at him in confusion. Sir, with all due respect, I don't think it's a matter of being upset over the loss of a friend so much as, I said, before John showed me his open hand, telling me to stop. Then you believe someone is playing a joke on you? He asked, and I nodded in response. John returned his hand to where it was before, looking at me. Then I will find the person responsible. Finish your shift. I want no further outbursts. Are we understood? John asked, and I knew that arguing with him wasn't going to do anything, so I nodded, understanding that this was out of my hands. John motioned for me to return to the door, and the communications worker didn't hear anything else after my outburst. The rest of my shift continued as usual, and I couldn't get what happened out of my mind, least of all the phrase, Deck 3, 4 o'clock a.m. I didn't have any scheduled maintenance on that deck, and I didn't want to upset John any further, so I didn't go to Deck 3. It was midnight when I finished my shift, and around 1 o'clock when I got to bed. While I was upset, I was still able to get some sleep, so I could wake up and start my usual time to work the next day. I woke up feeling more tired than rested, and I got to the lunchroom to have breakfast, but I heard shouting coming from the employee lounge from one of the supervisors. I looked at the guy eating next to me as if nothing was happening, and asked him what was going on. Apparently, one of the mooring lines broke off last night, and the personnel on duty were being questioned for not properly maintaining it. I then heard shouting from the room. The lines on Deck 3 needed to be reported for tension. The line broke at exactly 4 o'clock on your watch, the supervisor shouted. My breath hitched as I heard that. I stopped chewing the scrambled eggs in my mouth, suddenly remembering what I heard last night. That was exactly what Sam's voice said over the radio. Deck 3, 4 o'clock a.m. After I was done eating, I needed to get answers, so while I knew this was a bad idea, I got into uniform and walked into John's office. He was there looking over reports, and I knocked on the door. He glanced up and saw me, looking annoyed, but he waved me in. I walked in and took a seat. John, did you find the person responsible for the voice last night? I asked, and John shook his head in response. Frank, I have a snapped mooring line to handle. I don't have time to look into minor employee misconduct, he said, in his usual tone. Did the mooring line break on Deck 3 at exactly 4 o'clock a.m.? I asked, and John's expression changed from annoyance to curiosity. It did. How did you know that? He asked. Last night, when I thought I heard Sam's voice, it said Deck 3, 4 o'clock a.m., I explained, and John looked even more confused. Are you saying that someone was telling you about this and you didn't report it? He asked, and I shook my head. With all due respect, if I had told you that last night, you wouldn't have taken me seriously. Hell, I can't even believe something happened after I heard that voice, I explained, and John stayed quiet for a moment, considering my words. He sighed after he realized I was right. Fine. Report back to me during your lunch hour, and I'll bring in the same worker who also heard the voice. We'll see about solving this issue, he said, and I nodded at him. The lunch hour came, and the three of us were in the communications room. The worker explained that, aside from the voice, there was no evidence of any tampering with the communications equipment, and all else seemed to be working fine otherwise. Then it happened. The same headset started speaking, and John ordered it to be put on speaker so we could all hear it, and it spoke again. South by southwest, 9 o'clock p.m., it said, in Sam's voice. John didn't seem to flinch as he heard Sam's voice, and responded into the microphone. Identify yourself, John said, only to be met with the same response. South by southwest, 9 o'clock p.m., the voice said, and it spoke no more. The communications equipment went back to normal, and John seemed deep in thought. Very strange, John said, and he sighed before he turned to look at me. Get back to work, Frank. I'll handle this, John said, and I looked at him in confusion. John, you can't just say you'll handle this. That was Sam's voice, I nearly shouted, and John glared at me. Whoever's voice that was is irrelevant. Someone caused damage to this oil rig when they snapped our mooring line, and they've issued their next threat. This is a security issue, not an electrical one. Get back to work, he said, calmly, coldly, and with all the professionalism I had come to know for him. I wanted to push back more, but I knew it wouldn't have amounted to anything, so I returned to my duties. Around 8:30, about 3 hours after my lunch break, I was working on one of the west sides of the oil rig, doing maintenance, when I felt a sudden movement that almost took me off my feet. I could hear the wind from outside the wall howling, and due to the missing mooring line, the oil rig was drifting due to the wind. But I worked on oil rigs long enough to know that there was a waterspout coming. There was something off about this situation, though. We normally got warnings from our weather detection systems so we could evacuate or take shelter before they appeared, with enough time to react. This would have been doubly true considering we lost one of our mooring lines, of course. But I didn't have time to think about it in that moment. So instead, I reached for my radio and shouted into it. "All workers, take shelter! A waterspout is coming!" I said, and within seconds, another drift happened, nearly knocking me off my feet. After I regained my balance, I heard John on the other side. "Cancel that order. Our systems are not detecting any waterspouts, and some drifting from wind turbulence is to be expected with a missing mooring line," John said, and I got on the walkie again as I ran to the shelter. "You can't be serious, John! We need to take shelter now!" I shouted as I tried to gain my balance in the drifting. And I knew that John was feeling it too, which is why what he said shocked me. "I am serious. If any worker does not complete their quotas by the end of the night, they can expect a write-up. Frank, I'd like to see you in my office after your shift is done," John said, and I grunted in exasperation as the drifting continued. Once I made it to the shelter, I saw a few other workers there too, mostly the newer, younger guys who seemed scared for their lives. I hunkered down with them as the rig continued to drift slowly in the direction of the missing mooring line, and around 8:50, I heard John on the radio. "All workers, take shelter! There is a waterspout!" John shouted, finally realizing the truth. And soon after, the rest of the workers, John included, joined us in the shelter within minutes. At precisely 9:00 p.m., the rig was rocking back and forth, and the sounds of groaning metal and howling wind screamed from outside the shelter. An hour later, the drifting ended, and everything seemed to be back to normal. When we walked out, there was some minor flooding from the waterspout itself, and the southwest's corner's roof had caved in, with more rain coming in, accentuated by the sound of the wind. John immediately ordered the communications workers to call for help, and he took me into his office, which was still intact. John's usual glare was on me, but this time I was glaring at him back. "Frank, you are aware that there are consequences for insubordination, correct?" he asked, looking at me, and I could feel the air leave my lungs. "Insubordination? That's what you're worried about? John, we could have lost lives tonight. Some of the younger guys who were in the shelter when I first called out were in that southwest corner," I shouted, and John clenched his fists. "And they would have had more than enough time to reach the shelter when I ordered the evacuation. There is nothing in your contract that says—" I interrupted him there. "You gotta be kidding me!" I screamed at him. "John, get your head out of your work for 3 seconds and listen to yourself. We're getting warnings from Sam or whatever's using his voice, and the one time we had to take it seriously, you're choosing to ignore it until the last second?" I asked, no longer caring about my job as I glared at him. "What you're hearing," he said, accentuating each word, "is nothing more than some mindless chatter on the radio that's clearly coming from offshore somewhere. The fact that you identify it with Sam is nothing more than a coincidence at best or a mental failure of yours," he said, keeping his detached and cold demeanor. "Yeah, and if I hadn't ordered the evacuation then and there, would everyone still be alive? Would those young guys who took me seriously not be under a caved-in roof?" I asked, and before John could speak again, I kept going. "And another thing, Sam's voice predicted the mooring line snapping, and now he predicted the waterspout. Even if it's not Sam, then you can't deny that these things that are happening match up completely to the warnings we've been getting," I shouted, and John's face turned red for the first time, before he collected himself and took a breath. It was the first time I had ever seen him act this way. "Are you quite finished?" he asked, maintaining his cold professionalism, and I just glared at him as he spoke. Frank, as I said, these are nothing more than coincidences. Are you honestly telling me I should obey whatever random noise comes out of the radio? And all this talk of predictions. You're a man of science, not superstition. You can't possibly tell me you believe this, he said, looking at me. Yeah? What about you saying that you were going to handle it? My tone rose in aggravation. You said yourself that this was a security issue. What were you doing this whole time? Trying to track where the voice was coming from? Interrogating the workers? Looking for bugs in the computer system? Each word was louder than the last, before the communications worker rushed into the office. Frank? His nervous voice caught mine and John's interest. There's another message for you. It's from the same voice. Without a word, I marched to the speaker and talked into the microphone. Frank here. Go ahead, I declared, with my finger tremoring on the button. All areas, 3:00 a.m., Sam's voice declared. What? I whispered to myself, and then the voice repeated itself. All areas, 3:00 a.m. Silence returned to the microphone, and I jerked my arm to see my wristwatch. It was 11:12 p.m. I then turned to John, who was listening to all of this, and I nodded at him. Well, still want to write me up, or are we getting the hell out of here? My voice sounding less like a question and more like a challenge. John looked at the terrified worker who was looking at the both of us before he slammed his fist against the wall. The other worker winced, but I was too angry to care about the sudden change of pace from John. There should be an emergency maintenance crew on the way, John nearly growled, keeping his voice low. In the meantime, if there's even one more outburst from you, Frank, I'm firing you on the spot. He walked back into his office and slammed the door shut, rubbing the bruise on his knuckles where he had slammed his fist. As I walked out of the communications room, one of the younger guys was waiting for me, and I looked into his eyes. They were clearly terrified after this whole ordeal, but he had a phone in his hand. It was open, and there was a call from an unknown number. Hello, Frank, the voice said, and out came Sam's voice. I felt my eyelids recede to the back of my skull, but I kept listening. My death wasn't an accident. John set it up. He was sick of getting less respect from the workers. You have to get out of there, Frank. My blood pressure rose with each word. I wanted to go back into the office and strangle John myself, but I had bigger issues now. Something was going to happen to the oil rig, and if I didn't get myself and as many people as I could out, I didn't want to know what the consequences were. Sam laughed on the other side. I'll see you at Bourbon Street with some honeys, he said, before the call ended, and the young guy looked up at me, clearly scared out of his wits. I nodded and looked at him. Call the Coast Guard. We have to get out of here now, I said, and the younger guy nodded, calling the mainland. Within a few hours, at around 2 a.m., the Coast Guard arrived with helicopters and boats. Strangely enough, John was gone. There was a missing boat from the oil rig that had left. I also noticed his computer was missing too, which probably contained evidence of his murder of Sam. At 3:00 a.m., after we were all safely evacuated, the oil rig's living quarters broke off and it sunk the rest of the platform. Fortunately, the dig site held and no oil spill happened, so when the local news reported it, it was treated as simply as a result of the damage from the water spout. I quit working for the company that same day, but I still come back to Bourbon Street every year around July when Sam passed. The communications guy and the younger guy, who also heard Sam's voice, were soon admitted to a mental hospital after they swore they had heard the voice of a dead man. John's boat was never found, and due to the extensive damage on the rig, there was no way to implicate him as Sam's murderer. As for me, the thought of joining the men in the mental hospital is not one I relish, especially not since I now have a wife and 2 kids to care for. I only heard Sam's voice once more. He called me when I was in the men's room at a restaurant on Bourbon Street, and he only said one thing. I got him. I haven't received any calls since that day, and I promised myself I would never work on an oil rig again. If you're enjoying this video, please be sure to like and subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you get all of our latest videos. And if you have stories that you want to share with us, please send them to me, Ulrich Mossberg, at thedreadjournal@gmail.com. I'm sending you this story as proof that I existed. Please, whatever you do, don't let this fall into the hands of the company I worked for. send it to the papers or the news or whatever other media that exists. I just can't live with myself if I keep this story private. Someone has to know what we did, and not to repeat this mistake again. I'm Mark, and I've been a welder by trade for most of my life. My dad was a welder, as was his father before him, so I picked up the trade myself. When I was told that a major oil company needed a licensed welder to come out and work on one of their rigs, I was one of the first people to sign on. A few interviews later, I got the job. The company made me work in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico, and I was given housing in Fort Myers alongside a few other workers. I was also given deep sea certification for underwater welding work, courtesy of the company. I made friends with the guys I worked with. There was Jose, a Cuban from Miami who drank too much of that rocket fuel coffee, Jean-Paul, a Haitian who was a devout Catholic, and Jack, a Texan, who made the best barbecue I've ever had. We were all welders by trade, and while we came from different backgrounds, we respected each other and shared in our traditions together when we weren't on the rig. I also made sure to keep the guys fit. We went to the gym at least once every other day, and thanks to my intense workout regimen, I was able to whip them into shape. Our shifts mostly consisted of us performing maintenance on the structural integrity of the rig. We did work both on the rig itself, where the rest of the people worked, and on some underwater spots whenever the need called. Learning to work underwater as a welder was a challenge, but I managed to learn the ropes within my first few days. Of course, I also knew how dangerous the job could be, but we always had a team watching over us from the rig itself. We would spend entire days, or even a full week, in a saturation chamber to get our bodies used to the pressure we would experience as a result of going down there. It was rough to get used to it, but thanks to the exercise we did in Fort Myers, we were able to do it without any serious concerns. The worst parts about that chamber was getting used to it when we first went in, and then getting reacclimated to normal pressure once we were out. Our supervisor was an older man named August. He had been around the company for decades and was getting on in his years, but he treated us like family, often sharing funny stories of his childhood or talking about his grandkids, showing us pictures of them whenever he had the chance. He was the one overseeing our activities alongside the rig managers and other eggheads who worked on the rig. He was also a Catholic, like Jean-Paul, and the two led us in prayer for every meal. I wasn't a believer, but I chose to respect their beliefs and join in their prayers. Overall, things went pretty well for us for the first few shifts, and Fort Myers had plenty of places for us to unwind. If those days had lasted until the end of my contract, then I probably would have left the rig behind and gone on to start up my own welding business, or find a contract with some other oil company. Sadly, that wasn't what happened. During one of my shifts in January, we were told that the company was installing some new drills that would allow us to dig deeper into the reserves. August seemed thrilled about the change, as the rig was barely making its quota over the last year. I thought this was a good opportunity for the welding crew, too. It would show that we were capable of working with new equipment, and if we helped set it up, it would allow us to get raises, or at least look good on our resumes. The day the new digging equipment came, it also came with a representative from the company to oversee the installation. The guy was a big shot engineer the company had hired named James. I was told he graduated from some big Ivy League school, but it didn't matter to me that he had some degree. What mattered was if he knew what he was talking about. I had some reservations when I first heard about him from the rig managers, but I was later told that James was August's youngest son. I felt relieved as soon as I heard that. August's son shouldn't have been too different from him, and I was hoping James would be like his old man. Then James actually showed up. He came on board wearing a suit and tie, looking like he had just walked out of a high-rise building in New York City, and had glasses as round as my gut. His hair was short, sharp, and perfectly combed. I instantly thought he was some kind of fish out of water, as ironic as that saying felt at the time. And the first thing he did was look at the welding crew and sized us up, like he was looking at a piece of equipment when he met us. Rather than the warm smile and friendly demeanor August showed us, James took one look at us and didn't so much as blink before he turned away. "They'll do." His footsteps receded as he returned to talk to one of the rig managers. Immediately, all of us felt uncomfortable with that reaction, but August laughed it off. He assured us that James was quirky and a bit odd at times, but he ultimately meant no harm. I decided to shrug it off. He was clearly from a different world than the rest of us, and as such, he had different things to focus on. From there, he had a whole presentation ready on how to install the drill. He went over each detail with precision, and while I didn't understand the new technology he was talking about, I did understand the parts where he spoke about welding. It was simple enough, just weld some parts together once they were underwater, being careful not to cause any imbalances, so I wasn't too worried about it. The work began right after, and we suited up. I was used to wearing the diving gear by now. It had been a few months since I started, and the training was pretty simple. There was a radio in my diving suit, and we had flashlights to see our surroundings. I wasn't even afraid of the sharks, since they weren't as bad as the movies made them out to be. The worst they did was swim close a few times, but they left after we stood still, and it's not like I would get in trouble for using my welder on an animal that was trying to bite me. The one thing I didn't get used to was the darkness. It wasn't a big deal most of the time, but I hated the idea that something could come after me in the water, and I wouldn't have much time to react to it. I kept getting told that we had sonar in place to account for that, but no amount of blips and boops on a screen manned by August was ever going to make me feel better about going down there. I never voiced this feeling to anyone, though. Not like I could. For one, the guys would laugh at me for being afraid of the dark, and for two, if I wanted to work, I would have to go down there. Still, though, it unsettled me every time I took the bell from the pressure chamber to the seafloor. I would always make sure to see the moment from when we could see the blue water turn darker until it was pitch black. Once we were there, we hooked up to our umbilical breathing cords and walked to the diving point. The one thing no one ever told me about the deep ocean is how much sound there is. I thought it'd be quiet, but the truth is, sound travels quite fast, and the worst part about it is that you can never tell where it's coming from. I've heard everything from whales to dolphins, even some sounds that I couldn't or didn't want to identify. But the sound that no one ever talks about is the water itself. It's always moving, even if it doesn't look like it does, and even as deep as we were going, around 450 feet, I could still hear it. It's almost like a howling wind at the bottom of the ocean, and while it was the first sound that I heard every time I was out there, it was one I never fully got used to. The good news is that it was often a secondary sound, as the constant work chatter between the guys, August, and me kept me sane while we were working. We also left from the same door to work outside, and then came back in the same door at the same time. We had a bellman, but for the life of me I can't remember his name. He was there to make sure we came back up each time. When we walked outside with our diving suits, the ocean's noise surrounded me, and I nearly shuddered from how cold it was. It doesn't matter if the suits kept us dry. There was no way to fully stop the cold temperatures at these depths. Still, though, rather than reaching our assigned spots, we made it to the drop-off point, where a crane was lowering the new drill. We soon found it, and got to work setting it up. It didn't take much time to do that, considering we were listening to James's clear instructions, and he could see everything we were doing from the cameras in our suits, so we installed it pretty quickly. Once we were done, James spoke on the radio. "Well done. Now get away," he demanded, and we did as he said, before the drill started up. Loud doesn't even begin to describe what was going on as it began to drill into the seafloor, connecting to a separate line we already set up in preparation for the new drilling operation. We needed to stay and make sure everything was working fine, as James wanted to make sure that we were there to handle any mistakes. As far as I could tell, it worked just fine, and we were receiving reports of hitting more of the oil deposit. Then, a new sound came from the drill. I wasn't expecting to hear the drill groan against the seabed, but I did hear it struggle to break through something until it stopped entirely. Before we had time to react, the radio crackled. "Status report! The drill stopped!" James' voice nearly caused our ears to pop again from the pressure, and I grunted. "Monsieur James, I believe something is blocking the drill," Jean-Paul said, his voice sounding clearly as annoyed as ours. "That's apparent! Get over there and let me assess the damage from your cameras," James barked, and while I didn't like this attitude, I went over myself to take a look. Normally, when something like this happened, it would mean that where we drilled wasn't good enough to get more oil, so we'd likely have to get the drill repaired before we tried in another spot. The four of us surrounded the drill, and there was something odd as we approached. We heard a different noise. It sounded less like rocks breaking apart, and more like there was something in there that was alive. "Papo, there's something that's making a sonido that I don't know what it is, but it's no moving," Jose said, trying to tell James what was going on. "Then we're at the right spot," James responded, and we all looked at each other with confusion. "What do you mean we're at the right spot? There ain't no oil here," Jack said, and before James could respond, the drill started up again, moving even faster than before. I've heard a lot of different noises in my time working underwater, but this one was different. This one sounded like a scream. High-pitched, piercing, and clearly in pain. The sound was the least of our concerns, as the next thing that was coming out of the drill from where it was spinning was a red liquid. This wasn't any kind of oil we'd ever seen, and Jean-Paul screamed as he saw it. We had no choice but to return to the rig and the saturation chamber, and once we were dry, Jean-Paul started praying, and he kept repeating the same word over and over. Pitié, pitié, pitié. Each time he said it, he seemed even more scared. This was the same Jean-Paul who laughed when I heard wails and believed that through the power of his faith, there was nothing to fear. Yet here he was, saying mercy in French, over and over. Jack attended to him, and I went on the radio. "James, what was that?" I demanded, feeling my voice rise in frustration. "Mark, you're to take your team and return outside immediately," James said, as if nothing happened. Jean-Paul sobbed as he heard that. "Non, monsieur, non, pitié, s'il vous plaît," Jean said, clearly upset and crying, and Jose got on the radio. "Oye, we no going back out there. No somos tontos, papo. You gotta tell us what happened, ahora," Jose shouted. "And if you ain't gonna tell us, then put August on the line. He's our boss, not you, boy," Jack shouted as he gripped his microphone, like it was James's neck, while his other was patting Jean-Paul, trying to settle him down. "Enough." August's voice spoke through the microphone, offering us a sense of relief that didn't last long. "Gentlemen, I understand that this operation is unorthodox, but you gotta get your butts back out there. If that drill fails, we can kiss our jobs goodbye." August's voice was low and somber, which was different from the usual fatherly tone we loved him for. We looked at each other like we just got a punch in the gut, and Jean-Paul spoke through the microphone. "Monsieur, non, l'enfer." He shuddered every word, and there was radio silence on the other side for around 30 seconds. Then the silence broke. "There you have it. You have your orders from your boss. Get back out there or I'll report you all for insubordination." James's voice echoed through our heads like a death sentence. Jean-Paul was inconsolable, so the rest of us suited up again. We didn't make it outside as the diving area showed the red liquid had completely surrounded the area, making it impossible to see. "James, the water's purely red. We won't be able to see what's going on if we go back in," I said, and a minute later I heard James again. "Fine, return to the bell and take that sniveling co-worker with you," James said, and when we returned to Jean-Paul, he was already begging the bellman to take us back to the surface. Despite the red ocean water that covered our view and made Jean-Paul close his eyes as he cried, we made it to the top without any issues, and James and August were waiting for us, both looking disappointed. Before anything could happen, Jean-Paul broke down and started sobbing in front of both men. August exchanged his disappointment for compassion as he tried to console Jean-Paul, before the rest of us glared at James, who was as cool as a cucumber. "Tell us what that was, now," I said, barely able to keep my anger in check, and James sighed at us. "Look, you're nothing more than welders. I just can't give away confidential information about a company operation to—" I interrupted his words by slamming him against the wall, holding him up by his collar. "Mark, stop!" August shouted, but he couldn't do anything to stop me. "No!" I growled, glaring at James. "I need to know. Now, tell me everything or I swear I'm taking you down there myself," I said, my hands trembling with rage as I held James. James looked at me as though I were some bug, not even afraid that I was threatening him, and he shook his head. "My father is dying." His voice came out almost like a robot's, and I gasped, with August looking down, almost as if he was accepting his fate. "What we were drilling down there is necessary to save his life and the lives of millions of people," he explained, and I let him get back on his feet. "Fine, so you're getting some kind of medicine, but what was that red stuff?" I asked, and the other guys looked at him. "It was blood, you idiot," he declared, not even flinching as he said it. "Blood from what?" I shouted, looking at him. "You're not going to believe me if I explain." He was trying to avoid telling me. "Yeah? Try me." "Fine, let me go and I'll tell you." As much as I wanted to knock his teeth out, I let him stand on his own feet. He fixed up his collar like he was putting it back on before he looked at us. There's a specific fungus that grows beneath the seabed. It has proliferated over thousands of years and does so by feeding on the fauna in the seabed. This site was originally created due to a high concentration of the fungus in the area, but the local oil deposit made the company change direction, James explained. Furthermore, the fungus itself can sometimes capture the bodies of those who have fallen into the ocean and sunk to those depths. It can preserve their bodies and feed on them. When this fungus is combined with human blood, it can create a fluid that not only cures almost all conditions, but prevents further ones. The screaming you heard is nothing more than the fungus using the voice box of a dead person. Each word he spoke sent chills down our spine, and Jean-Paul sobbed as the explanation finished. That doesn't explain why the entire area was flooded with blood to the point where we can't see anything down there. My voice rose in anger with each syllable. That's why we found the right spot. The Gulf is no stranger to sunken burials at sea for religious, criminal, or colonial reasons. We didn't just find a good enough deposit until now, James coolly explained. I shook my head. You know what? No. Forget all this. I'm not messing with dead bodies, even if it does create some miracle cure, I said, and the other guys, except August and Jean-Paul, nodded with me. James shrugged. Suit yourself. Workers like yourself are a dime a dozen, but there's no way to cure my father's cancer unless we get more of this fluid, to say nothing of the others who will be denied life-saving medicine due to your refusal to work, James said, as if he were negotiating. I turned to look at August, who was looking down, clearly upset about this, and the other guys and I just looked at each other, trying to come to terms with what just happened and what we should do next. It wasn't long until Jose, Jack, and I decided to stay. Jean-Paul quit, and that was the last I heard of him. I don't know if he went back to Haiti or found somewhere else to live, but I do remember the prayer he left for us, almost as if he was asking God to save us from the devil himself. We continued working for as long as we could. Another drill came down, and the same screaming happened. More blood, more drills, more wailing that haunted our nightmares. This continued for months. Our 2 weeks off each month didn't feel like rest. There was the immediate relief of us reaching the mainland, but the dread of returning there hung over us. We stayed as a 3-man crew because we all knew too much, and James didn't want to risk any more potential leaks with Jean-Paul gone. Jack stopped cooking barbecue, and Jose tried to avoid nightmares by drinking more of his coffee to stay awake. On a return trip to the oil rig, Jack, Jose, and I didn't say anything to each other, but we did see James as he arrived. Normally, August was there to greet us too, but he was missing. His health had taken a turn for the worse recently, and the other rig workers confirmed he had gone to the hospital. We kept silent as we acclimated to the pressure in the saturation chamber, and made our way outside once we were ready. There were drill holes as far as the eye could see, each of them representing a place where we had dug into. I didn't dare look into these craters, but I did notice more shrimp and crab enter these craters, likely using them as their new homes. The one thing that I wished I noticed sooner was that there was nothing coming out. We had set up to drill to find more colonies, and it was supposed to be another day. That's when I heard another scream. It didn't come from the fungus. It came from Jack. "Something's grabbing me! It's pulling me!" His voice was a far cry from the usual tough Texan accent we all knew him for. I heard my heart in my ears. I had made my way over to his location. I saw him using his welding torch as a weapon at the growth that was dragging him towards one of the open craters, and while the growth screamed, it didn't let him go. Jose showed up right after, and we both pulled Jack as best as we could, hoping that we would have the strength to hold on until he was finished defending himself. According to the footage that we saw afterwards, it only took a minute to pull Jack free, but it felt like hours as adrenaline pumped through us. Once he was free, the growth receded into the crater, before more screaming from all the others began to dominate the soundscape around us, and we ran back into the saturation chamber as fast as we could until we reached inside. We were completely ignoring James and his demands for us to return out there, and made our way to the bell. The bellman took us up without question. Once we were back above water, James ran into the room. "What are you all doing? We haven't met today's quota!" At least, I'm sure that's what he said. Jack was still in shock, so he couldn't hear anything. Jose was muttering in Spanish, probably swearing at James or at what just happened, and I was still catching my breath when James was glaring at us.
Well?
He asked, like he was some teacher. James, the fungus was moving. It nearly took Jack with it into one of those dig sites, I said, matching his own glare. That's impossible. The camera showed no evidence of that, James said. Jack looked up at him with anger. Y'all can't be serious. There's more than just some fungus down there. His voice echoed with fear and rage. Yeah, and I don't care if August is in the hospital. You can tell him I quit, I said, too angry to care about my job anymore. Then James did something I never thought I'd see a man do before he told us what he did. He shrugged. If you mean my father, he's dead. Passed away around the time Jack started screaming. My eyes stung with tears. What? I asked. My voice lost volume as I said that word, before I grabbed James by the shoulders and pushed him against the wall. Then what about the medicine? Didn't you say that's why we were doing this? I cried out, tears flowing from anger. James just looked at me like I was a child having a tantrum. He couldn't afford it, James said, just like you won't be able to afford anything once you quit. But I'll give you one more chance. Let me go and head back down there, and I'll let this end with a write-up. Otherwise, pick up your tools and leave. I let James go and walked to Jose and Jack, shaking my head at them. We can't stay here, I said, and the other guys nodded. James scoffed. As you wish. I'll terminate your contracts immediately and inform the company of your lack of professionalism, James declared, and the guys and I just walked out. Fortunately, a helicopter was on the rig, dropping off another crew, so we were able to hitch a ride back. Naturally, we had to move out of our apartments in Fort Myers since the company subsidized them, but it wasn't a rough move. I still had my connections, and my family name carried weight, so I was still able to find a stable income. Jose had family back in Miami that would support him, and Jack went back to Texas. I can't say if the company ever unveiled the drug, or if they're still digging down there. I couldn't live with myself if the story didn't get out to the other oil rig workers. Please, if you find yourself in this situation, don't stay there. I still don't know what was down there, and I don't ever want to find out. I still hear the screams in my nightmares.